The letter in Grace Whitfield's trembling hands said one thing clearly. If she did not pay $8,000 by the end of the month, the bank would take the only home her family had left, and her two younger brothers would be put into foster care before the first snow of winter ever touched the fields of Millbrook, Texas. She read those words 3 times, sitting alone on the porch steps in the fading orange light, and somewhere behind her, through the thin walls of the farmhouse, she could hear 10-year-old Samuel laughing at something their little brother Caleb had said, unaware that the roof over their heads was already halfway gone. If you believe in second chances, in quiet courage, and in the kind of love that saves people before it ever says a word, I want you to hit that like button right now, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel because stories like Grace's deserve to be heard by as many hearts as possible. Now let's step into her world. Grace was 23 years old, but grief and responsibility had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with numbers. Her mother had passed from a long illness when Grace was 17, and her father, a proud but exhausted farmhand named Walter Whitfield, had followed 4 years later after his heart simply gave out one October morning while feeding the chickens. Since then, Grace had raised Samuel and Caleb almost entirely on her own, working double shifts at the diner on Route 9 and taking in mending work from half the women in town, all while trying to keep some fragile illusion of normal childhood alive for 2 boys who had already lost too much. She was shy in the way that people become shy when they have learned that speaking up rarely changes anything, so she had grown quiet instead, folding herself smaller so the world would ask less of her. It was Grace's aunt, a sharp-tongued but well-meaning woman named Ruth Calloway, who first brought up the idea of Nathaniel Hale. Ruth cleaned houses for some of the wealthier families outside town, and she had heard, through the long grapevine of Millbrook gossip, that the Hale Ranch was looking for a wife for its owner. Not out of romance, people whispered, but out of some private arrangement nobody quite understood. Nathaniel Hale was 30 years old, the last of the Hale bloodline, an owner of nearly 4,000 acres of cattle land that had made his family rich for 3 generations. He was also, according to every rumor that traveled through the diner where Grace worked, cold, withdrawn, and never seen smiling. Some called him heartless. Others said he carried a grief so heavy that no one had ever gotten close enough to know its shape. Grace had told her aunt, in the small firm voice she used for things she truly meant, that she would never marry a stranger for money, no matter how desperate things became. But desperation, as it turns out, has a way of rewriting a person's certainties. 3 days after that letter arrived, Caleb came home from school crying because another boy had said his family was going to end up living in their truck. And something in Grace broke quietly, the way ice breaks under weight nobody sees until the crack finally reaches the surface. That night, after the boys were asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with a candle burning low because the electric bill was already late, and she wrote a letter to Nathaniel Hale asking, in the plainest words she could manage, if the arrangement people spoke of was real, and if so, whether a girl with nothing to offer but hard work and 2 little brothers to protect might be considered. The reply came faster than she expected, written in a hand that was neat but heavy, as if the person writing it pressed too hard into the page from old habit. Nathaniel Hale said simply that he would meet her, and that if both of them agreed after that meeting, he would settle her family's debts in full and see to it that her brothers wanted for nothing. There was no mention of love in the letter. There was no mention of anything soft at all. And yet something in the careful, deliberate way he wrote made Grace fold the paper gently instead of crumpling it, as though some instinct in her recognized restraint rather than coldness. The meeting took place on a windy afternoon at the edge of the Hale property, beneath a sprawling oak tree that Grace would later learn had stood there since before the ranch had a name. Nathaniel arrived on horseback, dressed plainly for a man people said was rich enough to own half the county, and when he dismounted, Grace noticed immediately that his eyes did not match the reputation that preceded him. They were tired, yes, and guarded, but there was no cruelty in them, only the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent a very long time holding something together by sheer will. He spoke to her without unnecessary words, laying out the arrangement as though reciting terms he had rehearsed 100 times alone in an empty house. Marriage in name, a home for her brothers, her family's debts erased, and in exchange, she would run his household and, in his words, bring some life back into rooms that have forgotten what it sounds like. He did not ask her to love him. He did not pretend to offer his heart. And strangely, that honesty was what made Grace say yes. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the county courthouse, with only Ruth and the boys in attendance, Samuel in a borrowed tie and Caleb clutching Grace's hand so tightly it left marks. Nathaniel wore no expression during the vows that Grace could name, but when the boys were introduced to him afterward, something flickered across his face. Not quite warmth, but the shadow of a man remembering what warmth used to feel like. He shook Samuel's hand solemnly, as though the boy were already grown, and when Caleb, ever fearless, asked if he had horses they could ride, Nathaniel knelt to his level and said quietly that there was a mare on the ranch who had been waiting a long time for someone small enough to need her gentleness, and that her name was Clover. The Hale Ranch house, when Grace first walked through its doors as its new mistress, felt less like a home and more like a museum preserving a life that had stopped moving forward years ago. The furniture was fine but untouched. The photographs on the walls faced away or removed altogether, and there was a wing of the house, the east wing, that Nathaniel made clear, without explanation, was to remain locked. Grace did not ask why. She had learned long ago that some doors, literal and otherwise, opened only when a person was ready, and she suspected Nathaniel Hale was a man who had not been ready for a very long time. The early weeks of the marriage were quiet in the particular way that two strangers learning to share a life are quiet, full of small careful courtesies and long silences that were not unkind, only unfamiliar. Nathaniel worked from before sunrise until after dark, running the ranch with a steadiness that impressed even the roughest of his hired hands. And in the evenings he would eat dinner with Grace and the boys with a formality that softened, night by night, into something almost like comfort. Grace noticed things about him that the rumors in town had never captured. The way he always let Caleb sit in what was clearly his own chair at the head of the table without ever mentioning it. The way he taught Samuel how to mend a fence post with a patience no busy rich man should have had time for. The way he stood at the edge of the porch some nights and stared toward the locked east wing of the house as though listening for something that was never going to answer. It was Ruth, during one of her visits to help Grace with the enormous house, who first planted the seed of unease. She mentioned, almost carelessly while dusting a shelf, that she had heard from another housekeeper years ago that Nathaniel Hale had once been engaged, before Grace's time, to a young woman named Charlotte, and that Charlotte had died suddenly, under circumstances nobody in town spoke of clearly, right around the time the east wing of the house had been sealed off. Ruth did not know more than that, or if she did not say, but the words settled into Grace's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples she could not ignore. Grace told herself it was not her business, that a man was entitled to his grief and his silence, and that she had married him for her brother's sake and nothing more, so his past should matter to her as little as the weather in a town she would never visit. But shy people, Grace had learned about herself over the years, often notice more than they say, and the longer she lived in that house, the more she noticed how Nathaniel's eyes lingered on her sometimes when he thought she was not looking. How his hand paused near hers when passing a dish at dinner as though some old instinct told him not to reach further. How he had begun, without either of them naming it, to seek her out in the evenings not from duty but from something that looked, unmistakably, like loneliness wanting company. The turning point came nearly 3 months into the marriage, on a night when a storm rolled hard across the plains and knocked the power out across half the ranch. Grace had gone searching for candles in a part of the house she rarely entered, and in the chaos of wind rattling the windows, she found herself, without quite meaning to, standing before the door of the east wing, which someone, perhaps in the hurry of the storm, perhaps by some quieter design, had left slightly open. She knew she should turn away. She had promised herself she would respect whatever wall Nathaniel needed to keep standing. But lightning cracked outside, and in that flash of white light she saw, just past the doorway, a room frozen in time. A wedding dress still hanging in preserved plastic, unworn photographs of a laughing dark-haired woman, and a small, unfinished nursery with a crib that had never held a child. She stood there for a long moment, heart aching in a way she had not expected, and it was in that exact moment that Nathaniel found her, having come looking for her when the storm grew worse. She braced herself for anger, for the cold withdrawal she had feared since the day they met, but instead his face simply crumbled, quietly, the way a dam gives way not all at once but in slow, inevitable surrender. He did not order her out of the room. Instead, for the first time since she had known him, he began to speak. really speak about Charlotte, the woman he had loved since childhood, who had died in a car accident on the very road into town 3 days before their wedding, while she had been coming back from choosing flowers for a ceremony that would never happen. He told Grace, in a voice roughened by years of silence, that he had sealed the room not out of morbidness but because he had not known how to grieve in front of anyone, and that after Charlotte died, he had convinced himself he was finished with the idea of a real marriage altogether, that the arrangement with Grace had been meant only as a business transaction to quiet the loneliness of the house and give her family security, nothing more, because he did not believe he had anything left inside him worth offering a living woman. And then came the secret that changed everything, the one Grace had not been searching for and never expected to find. Nathaniel told her, haltingly, that he had known about her family long before Ruth ever mentioned the arrangement to her. He had, in fact, been the anonymous donor who quietly paid off a portion of her father's final medical bills 2 years earlier, after learning through town talk about a proud farmhand's daughter working 2 jobs while raising her brothers alone. He had seen her once outside the church, carrying grocery bags too heavy for her thin arms while somehow still crouching down to tie Caleb's shoe with a patient smile despite her obvious exhaustion. And something about her quiet strength had lodged itself in a heart he had believed was finished feeling anything. He had never intended to reveal it. He had told himself the marriage arrangement was purely practical, a way to help her family without pity, without her ever needing to know that a stranger's kindness years earlier had come from him. But standing in that storm-lit room, with the ghosts of his old life spread out before them both, he could not keep pretending anymore. Grace felt the floor of her understanding shift entirely beneath her. She had married a man she believed to be cold and transactional, a business arrangement wearing the shape of a husband, and instead she discovered a man who had been quietly caring for her family's well-being long before she ever knew his name, a man so wounded by loss that he had convinced himself love was something meant only for other people, something he had forfeited the right to when Charlotte's car left the road that terrible afternoon. She did not know, in that moment, whether to feel betrayed by the secret or humbled by it, and for a while she said nothing at all, only reached out and closed her hand gently over his, the first time either of them had touched with anything resembling tenderness since their wedding day. If this story has touched something in you, if you've ever loved someone quietly, sacrificed for family without asking for thanks, or carried a grief you thought no one else could understand, please let me know in the comments below, because I read every single one, and I want you to know your story matters just as much as Grace's. In the weeks that followed that storm, something in the Hale house began, slowly and carefully, to thaw. Nathaniel did not rush anything, and neither did Grace, both of them understanding instinctively that trust rebuilt after loss must be laid brick by brick rather than poured all at once. He began opening the east wing during the day, not to erase Charlotte's memory but to finally let light back into a room that had been suffocating in darkness for years, and eventually, with Grace's quiet encouragement, he donated the unworn wedding dress to a church charity and turned the unfinished nursery into a sunlit reading room where Caleb and Samuel would sprawl on the rug after school, doing homework beneath windows that had once been sealed shut. Nathaniel taught both boys to ride properly that spring, and Grace often stood on the porch in the evenings watching him laugh. Really laugh unguarded, for the first time since she had known him, as Caleb tried and failed to stay upright on Clover's gentle back. It would be untrue to say the marriage transformed into a fairy tale overnight, because real healing, the kind that means something, never works that fast. There were still nights when Nathaniel grew distant, lost in memories Grace could not fully reach, and there were still mornings when Grace, shy as ever, struggled to voice the feelings quietly growing in her chest, afraid that naming them might somehow break the fragile, precious thing they had built. But little by little, in the shared work of the ranch, in the sound of the boys' laughter filling rooms that had been silent too long, in the small unspoken kindnesses that passed between them daily, something real began to take root, something neither of them had entered the marriage expecting to find. He started leaving wildflowers on the kitchen table before dawn, never mentioning it, just letting her find them. She started sitting beside him on the porch each evening instead of retreating inside, her presence becoming, without either of them saying so aloud, the thing he most looked forward to at the end of every long day. The moment that finally broke the last wall between them came almost a year after the wedding, on the anniversary of Charlotte's death, a day Nathaniel usually spent alone at the old oak tree where he and Grace had first met. That year, without being asked, Grace walked out to find him there, saying nothing, simply standing beside him in the cold autumn wind as he laid a single flower at the base of the tree in quiet memory. She did not try to fill the silence with comfort, understanding instead that some grief only needs a witness, not a solution. When he finally spoke, his voice breaking slightly, he told her that for the first time in 5 years, the ache of that anniversary did not feel like drowning, because he was not standing there alone. And when he turned to look at her, really look at her, the way a man looks at someone he has finally allowed himself to love again, Grace understood that whatever had begun as a desperate arrangement to save her brothers had somehow, through patience and honesty and shared grief and slowly rebuilt trust, become the truest, deepest love either of them had ever known. Before I tell you how their story settled into its quiet, hard-earned happiness, I want to ask you for one small thing. If you've made it this far, please type the word family in the comments below, just so I know you stayed with Grace and Nathaniel all the way to the end, and so this story can reach even more people who might need a little hope today. Grace Whitfield, once the shy girl who believed she had nothing to offer beyond hard work and quiet endurance, became the woman who brought a dying house back to life, not by erasing its grief but by sitting with it, honoring it, and slowly making room for joy to exist alongside the memory of loss. Samuel and Caleb grew up on that ranch surrounded by more love and stability than Grace had ever dared hope for when she wrote that trembling letter 3 years earlier, and Nathaniel Hale, once known throughout Millbrook as the cold, unreachable cowboy on the hill, became known instead as a man who had learned, against every odd, how to love again without forgetting how to grieve. They never forgot Charlotte, and they never pretended the past had not happened. Instead, they built something new in its shadow, something sturdier for having survived real sorrow rather than avoided it. And Grace, who had once believed she was marrying a stranger purely to save her brothers, came to understand that the greatest secret of all was not the one Nathaniel had kept about the medical bills or the sealed room down the hall, but the quiet truth that had been growing between them all along, that sometimes the people who seem to need saving the least are the ones who end up saving each other completely, and that love, when it is real, rarely announces itself with fireworks, but instead arrives slowly, gently, the way morning light finds its way into a room that has been dark for far too long.